Okay. Welcome everybody to the ECFAS e-learning module dedicated to the impact approach built to calculate coastal flood direct impacts for population and assets on the European coasts. I'm Enrico Duo from the Consorzio Futura Ricerca and University of Ferrara in Italy. I'm a researcher in coastal geomorphology and risk, and I will guide you through this presentation. The results and products shown in the following were generated by a large group of people that I personally thank for the effort spent on this and other activities of the ECFAS project. I hope I did not forget anyone. This presentation includes some insights on the context in which the approach was developed, tested and implemented, a detailed description of the methodology and its validation, and a quick overview of its application in the ECFAS framework. With reference to the schematics of the ECFAS projects, the activities related to the impact approach belongs to the development of the warning component of the ECFAS system. In particular, the process is well represented by the scheme. A first phase was dedicated to the building of the model, including testing of alternatives, definition of the best approaches for each impact sector, and a validation phase. Then, the approach was applied to generate impact layers for each flood map contained in the ECFAS flood catalog, which is a collection of flood maps for extreme coastal scenarios around Europe to be used as a basis for operational rapid flood mapping. More information on this can be found in the ECFAS site and documentation, and in the e-learning module dedicated to the ECFAS flood modeling approach and flood catalog. Both catalogs are functional to the ECFAS warning component that generates daily forecast of coastal flood along the European coasts, generating warnings and flood and impact layers for the affected areas. The general approach follows a simple scheme. The most important impact sectors were considered, starting with population, buildings, transport, networks, and land use. The approaches were based for each sector on the use of available public datasets and impact models from the literature. Testing was implemented to identify the best available datasets and models for the application at the European scale. Once the approaches were defined, impact indicators were defined as well. Three guiding principles were applied while defining the approaches, depending on the availability of datasets and methods. First, object-based methods were preferred to grid-based mesoscale ones. Then, vulnerability models were preferred if available and if based on straightforward applications. Otherwise, exposure-based approaches were applied. Probabilistic approaches were applied when data and model availability allowed it, generating results with an evaluation of the uncertainty. Now, we'll go a bit more deeper on each sector. The impact on population, in particular, is considered the most important sector, as directly relating with human life, and it was selected as the driver for the definition of the warning levels. We'll see a bit more on this when describing the ECFAS warning component towards the end of this module. The impact to population is calculated through a grid-based approach, considering the exposure of people on the flooded area. We applied both the static global human settlement layer, referring to the year 2015, and the INAC layer, which includes layers for night and day population for each month of 2011. We applied a probabilistic resampling of these layers to include an evaluation of the uncertainty due to the layer variability. Note that pilot testing on a large number of test cases demonstrated that the variability does not affect the magnitude of the people presence on the areas of interest. The probabilistic implementation is applied on the resampling of the dataset that is based on the evaluation of an empirical cumulative distribution of the population affected for each flooded cell. Then, from the distribution, 1,000 values are randomly generated for each cell representing the distribution of affected people. If each of the 1,000 values represents a possible scenario, the distribution of the total number of people affected in the flooded area is estimated by summing all cell values for each scenario, generating 1,000 values of total number of affected people. A similar implementation is done for each probabilistic application described in the following. The impact to buildings is also considered very important, representing a large portion of potential direct losses generated by coastal flood. The implementation was based on an object-based approach, including vulnerability estimates through the application of flood damage curves from the literature for the calculation of the damage as a portion of the maximum damage, as defined by Huizinga et al. 2017. The OpenStreetMap dataset was used to define the position and footprint area of the buildings, while a reclassification of the Copernicus coastal zone layer was used to determine the building typology: residential, commercial, industrial, or transport. This represents a multi-model ensemble approach, as multiple flood damage curves were applied for each building typology, following Figueiredo et al. 2018 and the application from Du et al. 2020. Results are therefore generated including the uncertainty due to the applied curves. The impact to roads is considered important in terms of magnitude of potential losses, but also because flooded roads can seriously affect emergency operation and recovery phases. The approach was based on Van Ginkel et al. 2021, which represents an object-based method relying on the application of multiple flood damage curves and construction costs from the literature. The OpenStreetMap dataset was used to define the position, length, and type of the roads. The method from the literature was slightly adapted to include, along with the application of multiple flood damage curves, a probabilistic resampling of the construction costs from the literature. Thus, the results include an evaluation of the uncertainty related to the applied curves, as well as to the variability of the construction costs. Related to the impact to transport network, particular interest is driven by the railway network. Indeed, railways running along highly urbanized and touristic coasts are often directly exposed to coastal flood. The impact to railways was based on the direct application of the object-based method from Bubek et al. 2019. The deterministic method is based on the definition of damage classes depending on the flood depth affecting the railway, for which a repair cost is defined. The OpenStreetMap dataset was used to define the position and length of the railways. The impact on land use was implemented for agriculture, ecosystem, and nuclear plant lands. The Copernicus coastal zone layer was used to identify the appropriate assets. The method is therefore grid-based and only considers exposure through a deterministic implementation. The validation, comparing reported and model impacts, was applied for population, buildings, and roads. The comparisons were implemented for the extreme events of Cynthia at La Fort-sur-Mer in France in 2010, Xavier storm at Norfolk in UK in 2013, and the Emma storm at Cadiz in Spain in 2018. The reported impacts were retrieved by a thorough analysis of the resources collected during the first phase of the project, where available reports, media, and other sources were identified. In a second phase, the sources of information were systematically analyzed, including precious multimedia material, classifying and geolocating flood and impact markers for validation purposes. Additionally, satellite images were analyzed to map impacts. The validation approach followed this scheme. After appropriately comparing reported and modeled impacts, an evaluation of the comparison was implemented considering its reliability and representativeness. The reliability was defined based on the depth and quality of the comparison, considering if only general or more detailed information were used. The representativeness was defined based on how the comparison could be representative of the whole test case, as example, if the comparison was implemented for a specific building or using aggregated data. Then, a level of confidence was applied based on the defined reliability and representativeness of the comparison, from very low to very high following this table. For the affected population, since the available data were mostly related to casualties, injuries, or hospitalization, which numbers are orders of magnitude lower than the presence of people on the affected areas, only qualitative considerations were applied. On the other hand, quantitative comparisons were applied to verify the impact to building approach. However, given the large variety of available information, data manipulation was applied for the sake of harmonization. Comparisons were mostly implemented in terms of mean damage. For the damage to roads, since reported damage was very limited and mostly represented by visual information, the approach was validated considering the model relative damage that represent a degree of impact with the impact observed from pictures. In general, the integrated approach is considered to perform well with appropriate skills in assessing the magnitude of the impact to population, buildings, and roads. The approach was then applied at the European scale to generate the ECFAS Impact Catalog. The ECFAS Flood Catalog is a collection of flood maps for extreme scenarios around Europe to be used as a basis for operational rapid flood mapping. The coastal domain was divided into coastal sector, and 15 flood scenarios were simulated for each of them, considering local-based extreme total water level and storm duration. For each map, the ECFAS impact approach was applied, generating impact layers for population, buildings, roads, and other sectors. The two catalogs include almost 8,000 flood maps and more than 70,000 impact layers. The ECFAS warning component represents the operational component of the system. It relies on the use of the layers of the flood and impact catalogs to represent the flood impacts for forecasted extremes of total water levels at the coast. The workflow is based on a first check of the total water level forecast at the coastal points. If higher than a locally defined triggering threshold, the system is activated. Then, for each coastal sector, a check is implemented to verify if this is affected by the triggered coastal point. In that case, the appropriate scenario is selected from the ones available in the flood catalog, based on the characteristics of the forecasted total water levels. After this process, the system merges the flood maps and impact layers and aggregates the impacts at the administrative NUTS 3 level, assigning a level of warning depending on the number of people affected. Finally, the merged maps and layers are visualized through the ECFAS platform, for which in this slide we can see a few examples, for population, buildings, transport network, and land use. Thank you for following this module on the ECFAS impact approach. For additional information, I invite you to visit the ECFAS site and read all the available documentation or contact the consortium through this email.